A young woman looked right at my old worn cardigan and told me to leave. "Grandma can't even afford the dust in this store," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I just smiled, because I was waiting for the man I'd hired 30 years ago to walk out of his office and call me Madam Founder. The steam from my teacup fogged the window, blurring the city lights that were still glittering in the early morning. I've always been an early riser. The quiet of 5 a.m. is a comfort, a private space where the world hasn't quite decided to be noisy yet. My apartment is like that, too. It's quiet, high above the streets, filled with old books and furniture that has softened with age. I ran my thumb over the worn arm of my favorite chair. The velvet was smooth, almost gone in patches, molded to the shape of my elbows after decades of reading. My late husband, Robert, had bought it for me at a little antique shop on our honeymoon. He'd haggled for an hour, then paid the full asking price anyway because he saw how much I loved it. Robert was the one with the vision. I was the one with the hands. I had started it all in our tiny spare room with a second-hand leather skiving knife and a block of beeswax. Robert would come in late at night, smelling of ink and the cold city air, and rub my shoulders. "One day," he'd whisper, "they'll see what I see." He's been gone 15 years, and they did see. They saw and they bought, and our little workshop became a studio, then a factory, then an empire. I took a sip of my tea. Earl Grey. The bergamot was sharp and familiar. I'm 78 now. My silver hair is pinned in a simple bun, and I live a life Robert would have called sensible. I own the company, every share of it, but I am not its face. The magazines and the blogs show glamorous young designers and models, but they never show me. I made sure of that when I stepped down from the board. My anonymity is my most prized possession. I dress for comfort. Today it was my softest gray cardigan, the one with a small, careful darn at the elbow, and a simple pair of black trousers. My walking shoes are practical, supportive, and have seen many miles of this city. To the world, I am just another old woman, a grandmother, harmless and invisible. I find a deep, quiet joy in that. I looked at the old ship's clock on the mantel. 9:30 a.m. The flagship store would be open. I felt a familiar pull. It was a Tuesday, always a quiet day for retail. I like to visit on quiet days. I never announced myself. I never bought anything. I just looked. I'd walk the polished marble, floors, run my fingers over the new collection, and check the stitching. I was a ghost in my own house, and I loved it. I wanted to see the new spring line in person. I'd seen the sketches, of course. They were clean, minimalist, a return to our roots. But sketches are one thing. Leather is another. I wanted to smell it. I wanted to feel the weight of the hardware, to see how the light hit the clasp. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup in the porcelain sink, and left it to dry. I pulled on my simple beige raincoat, a classic trench that was perhaps 30 years old, but still perfect. I grabbed my keys, a simple brass ring heavy with use, and my small, worn black purse. It was one of my own, from a line I'd designed in 1983. The leather was supple as silk. I locked my door, the thunk of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet hall. I rode the elevator down, nodding at my neighbor, Mr. Chen, who was walking his little dog. "Morning, Mrs. Alastair," he said. "Good morning, Samuel," I replied. "A lovely day." He smiled, and I walked out onto the street. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement and the exhaust from a nearby bakery. I pulled my collar a little tighter and began my walk. It was 20 blocks to the store, a perfect distance. I was just another face in the crowd, a small gray-haired woman heading downtown, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The 20-block walk was brisk, and it warmed me despite the damp air. I turned the final corner onto the avenue, and there it was, Aurélien. The name was written in simple, elegant gold letters, set directly into the white stone of the facade. Robert himself had chosen that typeface. "It should look," he'd said, "like it has always been here." The doorman, a tall man in a long wool coat, saw me approaching. He gave me a polite, impersonal nod and pulled open the heavy glass door. "Good morning, madam," he said. "Good morning," I murmured. Stepping inside, the sound of the city vanished, cut off by the thick glass. The store was hushed. The air was warm and smelled exactly as I'd designed it to, a faint, clean scent of Spanish leather, beeswax, and a custom fragrance with notes of fig and sandalwood. My footsteps made no sound on the thick, cream-colored carpet that ran between the polished marble walkways. It was just after 10, and the store was nearly empty. Two sales associates, a young man and a woman in sharp black suits, stood near the front display of silk scarves. They were talking quietly. They both glanced at me. I saw their eyes take in my beige raincoat and my old cardigan. Their gaze passed over me without stopping, as if I were a piece of furniture. They returned to their conversation. I smiled to myself. Perfect. I began my ritual. I walked slowly, my hands clasped behind my back. I passed the scarves, letting my fingertips drift over a stack of heavy cashmere shawls. I paused at the shoe salon, admiring the clean lines of a simple riding boot. I was invisible, and it gave me the freedom to truly see. I saw a loose thread on the cuff of a blouse. I saw a small smudge of dust on a glass shelf. And I saw the way the light from the atrium fell on the new collection. In the center of the store, on a simple white marble pedestal, sat the Riviera clutch. I felt a small, quiet pull. I walked toward it. The bag was a deep, rich navy blue. The leather was smooth, with a low satiny shine. There was no logo on the front. There was no brand name. There was only the clasp, a solid, sculpted piece of silver, crafted to look like a single, perfect wave. I reached out my hand, my wrinkled, age-spotted hand, and touched it. The leather was cool and firm, but it yielded to the pressure of my finger. I lifted the bag from the pedestal. The weight was good. It felt balanced and solid, not hollow. I ran my thumbnail gently along the main seam. The stitches were tiny, set perfectly even, disappearing into the leather. I turned it over. The bottom was as flawless as the front. I tested the clasp. I pressed the small release. It didn't snap open. It made a soft, heavy thunk, and the wave piece lifted smoothly. It was a sound of quality. I looked inside. The lining was dove-gray suede, soft as powder. The rich, clean smell of the cured leather and suede rose up to meet me. I found the small interior pocket and slid the zipper. It moved silently, with no catch, no resistance. I remembered the meeting for this design. The new team had brought me sketches on their bright white tablets. Their bags were covered in chains, in logos, in hardware that looked heavy and loud. "It's what the market wants, Mrs. Alastair," the young head of design had insisted. "They want to be seen. They want a statement." I had looked at his designs, and then I had looked at him. "The statement," I had said, my voice quiet in that big, glass-walled room, "is the quality. The statement is the woman who carries the bag, not the bag that carries the woman. Robert and I started this company to make things that last, not things that shout." They were worried. This simple, logo-free design was a risk. But they had agreed. Holding the Riviera, I knew I had been right. It was the most honest piece we had produced in a decade. It was the kind of bag Robert would have loved. I felt a small, warm knot of pride in my chest. This was why I still came. To make sure the soul of the company, our soul, was still in here. I set the clutch carefully back on its pedestal, adjusting it by an inch to sit perfectly in the center of the light. I took a step back, content. I thought I would look at the wallets next. Ah, can you imagine? The voice was sharp, high, and it cut right through the store's careful quiet. It was like the scrape of a fork on a china plate. I turned from the Riviera clutch. 2 young women were approaching the handbag section. One was holding her phone up, filming. The other, the one who had spoken, walked with a self-important swing in her step. Her heels made a loud, sharp clack, clack, clack on the marble. She was dressed in a very expensive, very loud outfit. Logos were everywhere, on her belt, her shoes, her sunglasses, which were perched on her bright blonde hair even though we were indoors. She smelled strongly of a perfume that was too sweet, too heavy for the morning. She couldn't have been more than 25. "Tiffany, stop, you're being so loud," her friend whispered, though the phone's camera light was still on. "So what? This is my favorite store. They love me here," Tiffany announced. She stopped a few feet away from me and gestured toward the display. "I'm definitely getting the white one for the brunch video." She picked up a white bag from a different collection, one I personally disliked, covered in gold chains, and posed with it. Then her eyes landed on me. She looked me up and down, a slow, rude appraisal. From my practical shoes to my gray cardigan with its worn elbow, to my simple bun. A look of complete dismissal crossed her face. She laughed. It was not a nice sound. She turned to her friend, but she spoke loud enough for me and the associates at the front to hear clearly. "Look at this one." "Seriously, what is she doing in here?" Her friend looked nervous. "Tiff, come on." "No, I'm serious," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with scorn. She took a step closer to me. "Grandma can't even afford the dust in this store." I met her gaze. I didn't feel anger. I felt a familiar, weary sadness. I had seen this before. This wasn't confidence. This was a deep, rattling insecurity, covered up with expensive things. "Please leave," she said, her voice cold. "You're making the merchandise look cheap." I didn't scold her. I didn't defend myself. I simply smiled. It was a small, quiet, knowing smile. It was the smile I had given designers who told me something was impossible just before I showed them how to do it. The smile seemed to break her composure. Her face tightened, her cheeks flushing red. She hated that I wasn't intimidated. She opened her mouth to say something else, something worse. At that exact moment, the door to the director's office, tucked in the back corner of the floor, flew open with a bang that echoed in the quiet room. A man in an immaculate dark gray suit came rushing out. He was moving fast, almost jogging, his face a picture of flustered panic. It was Arthur Finch. I hadn't seen him in person in at least a year. He was in his late 50s now, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, but I still saw the earnest 19-year-old boy I had hired for the stockroom. The one who had reorganized the entire inventory system on his own time because he thought it could be better. Tiffany saw him coming. She immediately puffed up, striking a pose with the white bag, a bright, fake smile plastered on her face. She clearly expected him to greet her. Arthur didn't even see her. He rushed right past her, his eyes locked on me. He skidded to a halt about 2 feet in front of me. He was breathing hard. He smoothed the front of his jacket, and then, to the entire store's silent shock, he executed a bow so low his forehead almost brushed his knee. "Madame," he said, his voice breathless and full of a deep, genuine warmth. "Madame Founder, we are honored. Forgive the floor, we weren't expecting you." He straightened up, his face shining with relief and delight. "Is there anything I can get you? An espresso? Water? Shall I have them bring the new collection from the vault?" There was a total ringing silence in the store. Even the quiet music seemed to have faded. I put my hand on Arthur's arm. "Arthur, dear, stand up. You'll give yourself a head rush." "Of course, madam," he said, beaming. Then, I let my gaze drift past him. Tiffany was frozen. Her hand, the one holding the white bag, was suspended in mid-air. Her bright fake smile was gone, her mouth hanging open. The friend had lowered her phone, her own face pale with disbelief. The color drained from Tiffany's face. Her eyes darted from me to Arthur, back to me, and then to the simple, priceless Riviera clutch I had been admiring. I could see the words clicking into place in her mind. Grandma, manager, beau, madame, founder, founder. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I kept my hand on Arthur's arm, a steadying gesture for us both. The silence in the store was absolute. It felt as if all the air had been vacuumed out. The two sales associates near the front were rigid, their faces pale. Tiffany's friend had her phone pointed at the floor, her eyes wide with a kind of fascinated horror. And Tiffany. Her face was a mess of emotions. The shock had frozen her, but underneath I could see a hot, deep flush of humiliation. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish pulled from the water. I turned my gaze to her fully. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Young woman," I said, and my voice was calm and clear. "You are quite right. I probably shouldn't be here." Her face crumpled. She finally understood. I wasn't an intruder in her world. She was a guest in mine. I turned my back to her. I dismissed her from my mind as easily as brushing lint from a sleeve. Her story was over. My attention returned to the man I had known for 3 decades. "Arthur," I said warmly, "I was just admiring the Riviera. The clasp is perfect. You've all done wonderful work," he beamed, his entire posture straightening with pride. "Madame, that will mean the world to the design team. They were so nervous about your notes on the minimalist hardware." "Good. Nerves keep the work honest," I said. "Now, I was hoping we could talk. I've been reviewing the Q3 reports for the Strasbourg branch, and I have some notes." "Of course, Madam Founder." "Right this way!" He gestured, not toward the public staircase, but to the private elevator hidden behind a paneled wall. He offered me his arm. I took it. His suit jacket was made of fine, solid wool. As we began to walk, the store came back to life, but in a new, strange way. It was as if I had suddenly become magnetic. The sales associates, who had ignored me so completely before, now tracked my every move. They were busy, straightening displays that were already straight, avoiding eye contact, yet intensely aware of where I was. We passed Tiffany. She was still standing by the pedestal, as if her expensive shoes were nailed to the marble. She looked small. Arthur pressed a discreet button, and a dark wood-paneled door slid open, revealing a small, plush-carpeted elevator. We stepped inside. The doors closed, sealing us in velvet quiet. "It is truly wonderful to see you, Madame," Arthur said, his professional voice softening. You look well. And you, Arthur, how is Elizabeth? And the grandchildren?" His face lit up. "She's retired now, finally. And the twins are learning to walk. They're a handful." "That is the best time," I said, a small ache in my chest for Robert. "We never had children. This company, this was our child." The elevator opened directly into his office. It was a large, quiet room, but it wasn't cold. One wall was a great window looking down onto the sales floor. He had been able to see everything. The other walls were lined with dark, polished wood shelves, filled with leather-bound ledgers and archive boxes. It smelled of old books, wood polish, and the faint, clean scent of his cologne. He guided me to one of 2 deep leather armchairs near his desk. It was an old, comfortable chair, the leather worn just so. "An espresso? Or perhaps your tea?" he asked, already moving to a small, elegant credenza. "I still have that Earl Grey you sent from London. Tea would be lovely, Arthur." "Thank you." While his back was turned, my eyes scanned his desk. It was immaculate. not a paper out of place, but it was the wall behind the desk that caught my breath. Hanging there, in a simple, elegant black frame, was a piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, slightly brittle at the edges. It was a drawing, done in Robert's confident architectural hand. It was the original design for the company's very first handbag, the Alistair. Next to it, on a smaller piece of paper, a cocktail napkin, carefully preserved, was my own, softer sketch. It was the first drawing I ever did of the wave clasp, the one that was now on the Riviera clutch downstairs. I had drawn it 20 years ago, waiting for a delayed flight. I had no idea he'd kept it. Arthur turned, holding a steaming porcelain cup and saucer. He saw me looking at the wall. He came over and handed me the tea. It was perfect, hot, strong, with the sharp scent of bergamot. I keep them there, he said quietly, to remind me why we do this, to remind me of him and of you, of the standard. I reached out and touched the glass over Robert's drawing. He would be so proud of you, Arthur. I hope so, madame, he said, his voice thick for just a moment. He cleared his throat and sat in the other chair. Now, Strasbourg, you had notes? I took a sip of my tea. The hot liquid warmed me from the inside out. Down below, on the sales floor, the world of logos and loud voices continued. Up here in the quiet, the real work was being done, just as it always had been. I took a small black notebook and a slim silver pen from my old purse. The Strasbourg reports, I began, my voice settling into the familiar cadence of business. The numbers are strong, but I'm worried about the new supplier for the linings. The cost cutting is minimal per bag, but the quality is not our standard, Arthur finished. He nodded, his face serious. He had his own notebook open. I noticed it too in the last shipment. The weave is looser. It feels thin. Exactly, I said, pleased he was already on top of it. It won't last. It will pill. A customer will notice in 6 months, and we will have broken a 30-year promise. Find the old supplier, Arthur. Pay their price. I've already drafted the email, madame, he said. He closed his notebook. It will be done before lunch. We sat in a comfortable silence for a moment. The business concluded. I sipped my tea. Arthur looked out the large window, down to the sales floor. She's still down there, he said quietly. I glanced down. He was right. Tiffany and her friend were standing near the front entrance, by the scarves. They weren't shopping. They were just standing. They looked like they had been called to the principal's office and were afraid to leave. Who is she? I asked. Her name is Tiffany Vance, Arthur said. She's Richard Vance's daughter, the property developer. She has a large online following. She comes in often, mostly to film herself. She implies she's a major customer, but she usually asks for a significant discount or for items to be gifted for exposure. Ah, I said. It made a sad kind of sense. A young woman who had everything but valued nothing. She has never, Arthur continued, a hard edge in his voice, been spoken to like that in her life. She has certainly never been told no. I imagine she is terrified. She is probably trying to figure out if she should apologize to me in hopes I will prevent you from, I don't know, ruining her father. I'm not going to ruin her father, I said, sighing. She's just a silly, unkind girl. Yes, Arthur said. But that's not why I came running out, madame. He paused, and his gaze left the window and met mine. His expression was different. It was softer, more personal. You may not remember this, he said, his voice low. It was a very long time ago. My first month, I was 19. You were still Mrs. Alistair on the floor every day. I searched my memory. 30 years ago, 1995, the factory floor. The smell of glue and cut leather, the roar of the stamping machines. I saw a younger Arthur, yes. A boy, all sharp angles and nervous energy, pushing carts of leather hides. I was a student, he said, looking down at his hands. I had a full scholarship, but it didn't cover living costs. I was poor, not fashionably broke, madame. I was truly poor, and I was always hungry. He took a slow, deep breath. It was a Thursday. Payday was Friday. I hadn't eaten since Tuesday morning. I was in the staff canteen, in the old factory building. I thought no one was looking. I took a sandwich, a simple ham and cheese on white bread. I put it in my coat pocket. He stopped. I stared at him. I had no memory of this. The shift manager saw me, Arthur said, his voice thick. He grabbed my arm. He was shouting. Stealing was immediate termination. No exceptions. It was the end of my life. I knew it. No job, and my scholarship required me to be employed. I would be sent home. He looked up, and his eyes were clear. And then you were there. You came through the canteen doors. You must have heard the shouting. The manager was red-faced, holding my arm, showing you the sandwich. He pointed to the sketch of Roberts on the wall. You were wearing a blue dress. I'll never forget it. You looked at the manager. You looked at me. I was just a terrified, hungry kid. I was crying. I still couldn't recall it. The memory was just not there. You didn't raise your voice, Arthur said. You didn't fire me. You looked at the manager and said, I'll handle this. And he left. You sat down at that formica table with me. You pushed the sandwich back across the table. You should eat that, you said. And I'll get you a cup of tea. I was so ashamed I couldn't speak. You paid for the sandwich. You sat with me while I ate it. You didn't ask me why I did it. You seemed to already know. You just talked to me about my classes, about the new leather shipment. And when I was done, you walked me to the payroll office. You arranged a $50 advance on my pay. You told the canteen manager I was to have a line of credit until my checks cleared. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. You didn't see a thief, Madam Founder. You saw a hungry kid. You saved my life that day. You didn't just give me a sandwich. You gave me a future. He sat back. So yes, I recognized you. I would recognize you in a tracksuit. I would recognize you anywhere. That's why I will always, always bow to you. My teacup was cold in my hands. I hadn't realized I was holding it so tightly. I looked at this man, this polished, successful director, and for the first time I remembered. The small, cramped canteen, the smell of stale coffee and bleach, and a boy, impossibly young, shaking with shame. It had been such a small thing. A sandwich, a $50 advance, an act of simple dignity. It was a choice I had made in a moment and forgotten in a day. For him, it had defined a lifetime. I set the cold teacup down on its saucer. The porcelain made a soft clink on the polished wood of Arthur's desk. For a long moment, I said nothing. I looked at this man, my employee, my friend. I looked at the sketches on his wall. You were a good investment, Arthur Finch, I said finally, my voice quiet. Robert always said the best investments were in people. He was right, Arthur smiled, a small, genuine smile. I've tried to live up to it, madame. You have, I said. I gathered my purse and my small notebook and stood up. The old leather chair sighed as I rose. But I have kept you from your work long enough. It was no interruption, he said, standing with me. It was an honor. Will you be at the quarterly review next month? I'll be there, I said. Send the agenda to my home address as usual. Of course. He walked with me to the private elevator. We rode down in that same comfortable, warm silence. When the paneled doors slid open, we were back on the sales floor. It was as if a switch had been thrown. The two associates at the front, who had been whispering, snapped to attention, their backs rigid. A stock boy who was adjusting a display of wallets froze mid-movement. Every eye in the place was on me, but no one dared to meet my gaze directly. Arthur walked with me, not with his arm offered, but a half-step behind, a respectful, protective escort. We crossed the short distance of marble between the elevator and the front doors. Tiffany Vance was still there. She and her friend were standing by a pillar near the entrance. They had clearly been waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't sure. For me to leave? To see if she would be thrown out? As I approached, her friend shrank back, trying to become as small as possible. But Tiffany stood her ground, though her face was pale and her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes, which had been so hard and cold before, were now wide and pleading. She looked like she wanted to apologize, or to run, or to cry. She opened her mouth and her lips trembled. I didn't stop walking. I didn't slow down. I simply turned my head as I passed and looked directly at her. I gave her a single brief nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was not a nod of anger. It was just a nod, an acknowledgement. I see you. And then I looked away, toward the door. I saw her flinch as if I had struck her. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the floor, her shame visible to everyone. It was a more powerful correction than any words I could have spoken. The doorman, the same one who had given me an impersonal nod earlier, practically jumped to action. He pulled the heavy glass door open with a flourish. His back ramrod straight. "Have a wonderful day, Madame Founder," he said, his voice full of a respect he hadn't possessed an hour ago. "Thank you," I said, stepping past him, and then I was outside. The air was cool and damp against my face. The sounds of the city rushed back in, the rumble of a bus, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of people walking past me on the sidewalk. I pulled my old beige trench coat a little tighter. I took a deep breath of the ordinary, exhaust-filled air. I was invisible again. I was just Mrs. Allister, an old woman in a sensible coat. I turned right and began my walk home. The interaction in the store, the moment with Tiffany, already felt distant, like a scene from a play. It was loud and dramatic, but it was over. What stayed with me, what I carried as I walked the 20 blocks home, was not the memory of her insult. It was the weight of Arthur's a ham sandwich, a blue dress, a simple act of kindness, forgotten by me, but becoming the foundation of a man's life. Robert had been right. It was always about the people. The bags were just the things we carried them in. The walk home cleared my head. The city was busy now, people rushing to and from their lunch appointments, but they parted around me like water around a stone. I was just part of the scenery. I unlocked the heavy front door of my building, nodded to the concierge, and rode the elevator up, alone. I let myself into my apartment. The click of the deadbolt sliding home was a sound of deep, satisfying quiet. My home was warm. It smelled of old books and the faint, sweet scent of the lemon oil I used on the furniture. I took off my beige raincoat and hung it in the hall closet, where it belonged. I slipped off my walking shoes and put them on the mat. I was no longer Madame Founder. I was just Alara Allister home. I went to the kitchen and washed my hands at the sink, the warm water a comfort. I was a little hungry. The espresso Arthur had offered sounded nice, but I preferred to eat simply. I opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with simple, good ingredients. I saw a head of celery, a bag of carrots, an onion. In the freezer, I had a container of chicken stock I'd made last week. Soup. A pot of soup was what the day called for. I pulled the vegetables out and set them on my old wooden cutting board. This board was as old as my company. It was scarred with 1,000 knife cuts, worn smooth in the middle, and stained from beets and berries. I took my best knife, heavy, balanced, and perfectly sharp, and began to work. The thock of the knife on the wood was a steady, familiar rhythm. I diced the onion, my eyes watering just a little. I sliced the carrots into perfect thin coins. I chopped the celery. The movements were automatic, precise, practiced over a lifetime. As I worked, I thought. I didn't think about Tiffany Vance. She was a ripple on a pond, already vanishing. I thought about Arthur. A 19-year-old boy so hungry he was willing to risk his entire future for a ham sandwich. I had forgotten the incident completely. It was one of 1,000 small decisions made in a long life. To him, it was everything. I put a little olive oil and butter in my heavy-bottomed pot. The onions and celery went in, and the kitchen filled with a sharp, sweet smell as they began to soften. Robert and we had been hungry once, not in the same way as Arthur, but we'd had our share of dinners that were just bread and cheese, eaten while sitting on the floor of our first tiny apartment. We'd poured every dollar we had, and every dollar we could borrow, into that first shipment of Italian leather. The risk had been enormous. It had felt, in its own way, like starvation. I added the carrots and the broth and a bundle of thyme from my window box. I turned the flame down low and let it simmer. The whole apartment began to fill with the warm, savory smell. This was real, this pot of soup. The weight of the knife in my hand, the worn velvet of my reading chair, the framed sketch of Robert's first design. Down on the avenue, the store was a world of logos, of performance, of people trying to prove they were important by the things they bought. They didn't understand. The bags were never the point. The quality was the point. The work was the point. The quiet pride in making something with your own hands that would last longer than you. I ladled the steaming soup into my favorite porcelain bowl. I cut a thick slice of sourdough bread and sat down at my small kitchen table. The soup was hot and clean. The carrots were sweet. True wealth was never about the stores or the money or being called Madame Founder in a room full of people. It wasn't about being seen, it was this. A quiet room high above the city. A good meal that I had made for myself. The memory of a long, good marriage. And the knowledge that, all those years ago, I had given a hungry boy a sandwich, and he had become a good man. I took another spoonful of soup, content.